We never lived in that house for long, did we? Number 42 it was. I remember the fish, do you? The angel fish on the tiles in the bathroom. Black and white it was.
Number 42. The Fragrance of Mortality. I thought I'd better come clean and admit a few things before we begin. I cannot make anything happen. I can't even intervene or nudge things to bring matters to a swift conclusion. I'm pretty powerless, actually. I might appear in all stories sooner or later, just when people aren't really expecting it, but I don't actually do anything. I just let things take their course, and I have to be around for the finale. I get blamed that it's happening, but it comes to all of us. Well, nearly all of us. And in the end, your particular fate really just is that. Yours. I have to be there, naturally, ready to officiate, so to speak, when it befalls you. But I don't actually intervene, despite my reputation. I don't do any reaping. So don't blame me if that particular pill pushes you over, or after one too many cigarettes you're snuffed out, or a life of whiskies pickles you, or because you didn't look both ways before you crossed the road. I just hang around waiting, staying patient, a bit like a reception committee. A reception committee of one for one. But I do take it seriously, very seriously in fact, and I deal with you all individually in the end. And if you do have any complaints, what are you going to do about it, eh? It's too late. I've been following this one, Marcus, for a long time. He's always on the periphery, so nearly there more than a few times actually, walking a path that skirts the edges of your world. He doesn't seem to bother too much about what's going on. Quiet sort of man he is, unless something spurs him on, like an injustice or thoughtlessness that riles him, acting like a trigger. And then you'd better get out of his way, because if he acts, he certainly acts. He leaps powerfully with the determination to put things right, to stop some undesirable and uncalled for cruelty, even if he has to resort to violence, which he detests. Afterwards, he acts calmly and asserts his placid smile, although I can see it does affect him. It gets to him, and is a slow attrition of his patience, needling him when he stops to think about it. And in the long run, that will make a difference. He's not blasé by any means. He just gets on with the job in hand, with the life that has fallen in his lap. He has learnt that much, to get on with it, which is more than most, I can assure you. Most people I meet, well, they are more than a little surprised to see me, if I'm honest. I can see I'll have to be patient with Marcus, though, and wait. After enough time, you just get used to delays and false starts. And there's always someone else to be seeing to, anyway. I can't actually see it coming, you know. I'm not omniscient. Even if I do get a hunch, an intimation when things are about to kick off, as you say. But we all have to face the final curtain. Well, you do. He didn't live at number 42, this Marcus chap. His daughter did, with her two boys, Dominic and Justin, his grandsons. And their father, Mr. George Riley, of course. No, Marcus lived up the road in Chelsfield, on that estate they built just after the war. It went up so quickly I hardly even noticed. But I was having a bit of a rest by that point. You can't work overtime full on for all those years and never get a bit of slack time. But even in that baby booming time, there is always a little one to pick up, here and there, you know. I know it sounds awful, but not every bud blossoms on the tree, and it comes with a job. Well, Marcus was gardening by this time, nurturing all kinds of plants. And not just seeds. He was making beautiful gardens with trees and shrubs too. He liked to sculpt the landscape, to use stone, cutting the pieces with his strong hands to shape impressive lines, sturdy walls, and smooth paths. He did fireplaces too. Building work, mechanics. He had a lot of skills. He did the terracing in the back garden of the preschool playgroup, you know, up on Chislehurst Road, yes, where Dominic and Justin went, and those other children who live along the street there, Dalip and Arthur. They'd all played in his garden, climbing up his steps, running over those paths that he had laid, even if they weren't really aware of it. But don't let me digress. I was at number 42. It was not long after I thought I was going to collect both of the boys earlier in the year. Well, they all thought about it too for one moment, but it was a false alarm for all concerned. But then I showed up there at Christmas. They were all there, Marcus and his wife, Deborah with George, Julia and the boys, and they'd had a lovely day, opened all the presents and eaten their massive turkey dinner with the crackers and such like. And after they'd watched a film on their black and white TV, the adults were playing cards, a good game of canasta before getting out their coppers and halfpennies and having a few hands of brag. Well, it's interesting how you can all blame the cards then, when things don't play out as you wish, especially when money is at stake. But who's bragging who when they are playing a game of chance like this one? I keep reminding people that they're gambling every second. Every time you breathe in doesn't mean you get to breathe out. But nobody listens to me. The boys were busy with cars on the floor, steering little wheels around adult legs and crashing into the skirting boards. And it was calm and peaceful in the glow of Christmas lights. There was a nice record playing. It was 1968, so Sinatra's cover of Both Sides Now was turning on the radiogram, smooching out its gentle melody. And it is in the smooth moments like this that when you can get caught out, it can catch someone like Marcus completely unawares. It only takes a peanut. They say you shouldn't throw them up and catch them in your mouth. And it's true. I've seen it quite a few times. I could count them if you like. I have to keep records like everyone else. Well, Marcus knew too, but he did it anyway. He took a nut, threw it up, pushed his head back, just to entertain Justin, who had parked his dinky car and was watching his grandfather. And of course it didn't go well for him. In a few moments he was leaning over and heaving. He was coughing and choking, and everyone panicked and jumped up. Justin's eyes nearly popped out in surprise. Cough, cough, cough. You could tell from Justin's 3-year-old expression that he was certainly never going to do what his grandfather had just done with the peanut. Not after seeing Grandad turn so red, and the air seemed to turn solid in his lungs, so that his breath seemed to stop. But it didn't sound right to me. You get to know when it's going to be fatal. This one was a loose rattling in his throat, shifting a bit too easily, and it was coming out. Bingo! I was right. He coughed again as Julia was slapping his back, and as he leant over, it shot out. It was all over in a minute. Silly Grandad, Julia had said, but he's all right now. she added, putting her arm around Justin and holding him closer as the terror drained from his eyes. Marcus had settled down after a while with a nice drop of water. Panic over. In 10 minutes he went back to his whiskey, and the grandsons were making engine noises under the table again. A near miss. But then he's had more than a few, I can tell you. I couldn't actually see what was going on when he was born. You can't when the little ones are still inside. And I'm not keen on, going in there into the flesh unless I really have to. Can be very claustrophobic on the inside. And Marcus was very nearly out anyway. His head was down and he was being squeezed out into the cold night air. But what they didn't know, till later, was that the cord was wrapped around his little neck. So there was Mummy Marcus pushing away, panting and pushing again, and totally unaware that Marcus might not make it. They didn't have ultrasound in those days. Then thankfully for Marcus and his mummy, Mildred, that was the midwife, she'd seen hundreds of babies into the world, and as I said before, I'd been at a few of them. Well, she spots it's a nuchal cord, and quite tight. So she pauses things, clamps, snips, and all is well. And I'm brushed aside, just like that. But I do get to see Marcus slip on the bed and cry his little lungs out. It was so beautiful. But that wasn't the only time he was in a tight spot. You can say cats have 9 lives. Well, Marcus must have had that and some. Over the years I've caught sight of him climbing trees and slipping or jumping off tall buildings and landing poorly. But he always seemed to jump up and run away from me. I nearly had him when he jumped into the sea and there was a rock half hidden and he only saw it at the last second and dived to the left. I lost track of him for a while after that, till the war, when both he and I were busy all over the place. I chased him in Africa for a little while, but to be honest, I was going around clearing up after him. He was with a sneaky little group who left a trail of destruction. Actually, he got to be good at moving around surreptitiously, and I had to work extra hard just to spot him. One evening, he was sent with a truckload of ammunition, like a clandestine delivery it was, at night. But he decides to stop off for a few hours at Deborah's parents' house. She's not expecting to see him, of course, but he parks up outside and taps at the back window and then climbs into her bed. Well, not long after, the fireworks are going off, and I don't mean in the bedroom. The air raid siren wails and laughs diabolically as Marcus is really enjoying himself, and he has to jump up, grab his clothes and run for the truck in just his skivvies. "If I don't move that blooming truck and they start bombing here, the whole street will go up," he says as he pulls on his shirt. So he drives off, more than unsatisfied. Deborah closes the door and tootles off to her shelter, equally unsatisfied, and I'm left floating around like an unexpected fart, completely unsatisfied too. I've had another wasted trip. Then later, in 1943 or thereabouts, it was all a bit hush-hush, careless talk and all that. But they were all up in Norfolk, on the beaches, training for a large-scale assault on Europe. Well, Marcus is the driver, in a truck, and thankfully this time he has his trousers on, and when the landing craft hits the beach, he has to have the engine running so that as soon as the door drops down, off he goes, full speed, and he has to drive that truck out, through the water and up the beach. Well, that's the plan anyway, and you know about the best laid plans, I'm sure. It's noisy, see, with the real ammunition and explosions, so they aren't freaked out when it comes to the real thing. No one's aiming to hurt anyone, though. It's just simulation, right? But how do you simply simulate a bomb going off in a beach landing? that lifts more than a few hundred tons of sand, gravel and water into the air. It's beyond me. And what goes up doesn't always come down in the same place necessarily. So they blow a bloody great hole in the beach right where the landing craft are fast approaching. I can still hear the rumbling and the motor of the landing craft grinding thunderously over the noise of that idling truck, and Marcus shouting, "Ready, ready, ready!" And the officer next to him says, "Wait, wait." And suddenly there is a crash and a wall of daylight slams into their faces, blinding and bright, and the officer screams, "Go, go, go!" Marcus lifts the clutch, which bites, and the truck leaps out, crashing into the light, and then into the sea that floods the ramp, and then down, down, down towards the beach that isn't a beach anymore, but is a hidden hole. And off the ramp into the vast hole he goes. The truck sinks, and as the truck drops beneath the water, Marcus looks right where the next landing craft has emptied another truck into the sea, and it is stuck, so that the men are jumping out and swimming and screaming to watch out, except the poor sod, the driver, of course, who is stuck in the cab beneath the waves. Marcus turns to the officer, who is screaming even more now. "Drive! Drive! Drive! Keep your fucking foot down and drive!" And the engine screams too, and the wheels turn and turn, and water pours into the cab, and the wheels are spinning uselessly in nothing, and then they clip something, and then there is a jolt, and then there's a clasp, as if the truck might be trying to bury itself deep in that hole until it suddenly jolts, bites something solid and moves, catches, grinds, screeches, and then jolts again and pulls itself forward. Then with a lurching, juddering, slow climb, it drives slowly up and out of the hole, so that the water falls away from the screen and they see daylight once more. They are out. Their pulses drop quickly to beat with the time of the windscreen wipers that thud noisily back and forth. I leave them then, busying myself only yards away. As they drive up the beach, into the smoke of the fake war, Marcus looks back in his mirror to see the other driver. It is Jack. He knows him. He's been pulled lifeless from the other truck. His body is limp as it is heaved through the cold sea, to be laid out on the wet sand, where 100 heedless feet run past him, and a voice screams, "Move! Move! Move!" Well, Jack didn't make it, but Marcus drove off up the beach, readied for the real thing in a year's time, except then it's June the 6th, and it was really real this time, with intended killing, one of the bloodiest bits of the war. And I was as busy as hell. There weren't just a few bombs. There was incessant shelling that was aimed directly to hit and destroy each truck and eviscerate each man. And Marcus wasn't just blinded by light, but blinded by smoke and battle debris and body after body of his fellow soldiers who had not made it off that ramp and whose wounds were turning the sea red in the carnage of Normandy. And when he drove off this time, he just drove and drove, and I lost sight of him while I swept back and forth over the sands and dived beneath the waves to bring each lost soul away from the death that was unfolding minute by minute by minute. In Deborah's bedroom, she lines up the photographs that Marcus sends home on her dressing table by the mirror. In each one, he's always smiling. His uniform is not always neat and his face is a little weary, but he smiles and sends a clipped message. From northern France. Miss you. And 3 kisses. From northeast France. All my love. And 3 kisses. And there he is again, his arm around his best mate, Peter. All dressed up and nowhere to go, he says. And when they have been able to get a shower after the days and weeks of fighting, and they are slowly moving eastward, the fighting is getting more intense. And that's when I catch up with him again. In the winter, near the Ardennes, in a village on the edge of France and Belgium. It is remote. I watch him. They are guarding the empty house and take it in turns to sleep. 2 on duty, 1 sleeping. They catch a chicken that is scratching in the yard and cook it, eating a feast of a meal that gives them a little hope. And all the while they watch the road and listen. And I watch and listen too, because I have a sense of a lull, a calm before a new storm. I know that I will be needed here, so I wait and linger in the shadows, like a smell. Peter is on duty at the top window while Marcus patrols the edge of the farm, and Jim is sleeping. They sleep in a makeshift bed they have set up in the large fireplace. It's like an inglenook with a great stove. It's warmer here from their cooking, but they can't keep the fire at night, so the temperature drops. They loosen their boots and take it in turns sleeping. Whoever sleeps goes outside after making up the fire and then watches upstairs before getting his head down. The sky is dark, but there is a bright moon that flirts with the snow that is falling now, and it offers fleeting glimpses of the icy ground that catches it. They are careful with the blackouts, so it's hard to see Marcus when he makes his way back. He has not heard anything for the last 2 hours, but I hear his teeth chattering. Peter hears his gentle rat-a-tat-tat knock, and then the door catch lifts. An unwelcome solid wall of icy wind slides in beside him. Bloody hell, it's brass monkeys out there, Marcus says, and breathes heavily, struggling with the cold. He sits by the fire, which has burnt low. You all right? Peter asks. Oh, it's just a cold. I'll be all right in a mo. Well, it's cold as a witch's tit upstairs. I dread to think what it's like outside. All quiet? Still as a graveyard, Marcus replies, shivering and breathing in a little more easily into his hands, which he rubs, cups and puffs into, now that he has removed his gloves. Oh, any of that soup left? He says, and goes to the stove. Hey, Sleeping Beauty, time to get up and out. He nudges James, who moves slowly. For a few moments they act like a family in peacetime. All is a domestic instant of eating, drinking, and James laces his boots up. Put your collar up, over your scarf, Marcus says. When James has left, Peter nips out to splash his boots, and when he returns he's shocked at just how cold it is. You must be absolutely freezing, mate, he adds. And then he says he can't sleep yet anyway, so he'll swap with Marcus. He'll do another watch upstairs, just for an hour or so, and Marcus can get his head down and get a bit warmer. I'll come and get you in an hour when you've warmed up a bit, Peter says. I wait. The minutes tick by. I see a bright red light from a cigarette that James has lit. He's not supposed to, but he hides it in his hand, and he passes right by me as I'm waiting by the pond, and I see a gentle amber glow on his face as he inhales. The surface of the pond has frozen and the snow is beginning to lay across it, obscuring it. They'll have to remember where it is when they leave, or they'll fall in. I tried to remember the last person I met in a frozen pond, but it was a long time ago, a child of 7, but I'm quite sure these men will not be so foolish. Whatever it was that gave them away is unknown. Perhaps the fire shifted in the stove, igniting the unspent fuel, sending up a flare of sparks to form a red glow in the chimney. Perhaps it was James's unwise cigarette. Or perhaps it was just a stray shell fired at a known building as the enemy left. Or it was none of these. Just a jettisoned, unused bomb from some plane returning from a late-night sortie as it headed back to England. Or perhaps it was that flirt of the moon, teasing the landscape with her disloyalty and offering up the silhouette of the farmhouse to an eager-eyed gunner. Who knows? I only deal in the consequences of these things. I just had to wait for the chaos of the ear-splitting explosion, the thunderous heaving, the rumbling and the heart-stopping cracking, and the thudding, falling and shuddering of the obliteration to settle. James was the only one moving in the morning. The house had gone, and since he had been across the field, he had witnessed it all. And I was settled over the debris. You couldn't see me, but like the steam and gases that rose from the destruction, I was there. I had claimed one soul and was waiting on another. Just a little longer, I thought. James ran to the pile of rubble, scrabbling and calling out. Somewhere in there, Marcus must be dead. He'd been upstairs and the whole upper floor was gone. It had collapsed in on the kitchen area. "Peter? Marcus!" he shouted, pulling at stones, brick and timber and pushing it aside. After 20 minutes, he found a boot. It was tied on a lifeless limb that was trapped. It must be Marcus. And then he moved over to where the chimney stack had provided a little support and protection. The building was concertinaed and heaped over it so that whoever was sleeping might be all right. "Peter? Peter? Peter!" James called as he started digging. He pulled and pawed and removed the debris. His hands were cut and bruised, yet he pushed on desperately. Then there, buried in the dirt of the destruction, he saw the face, powdered in ash and dust, whose eyes flickered and then blinked. But it was Marcus's eyes that looked up. Then he coughed and spluttered, and James found him some water, and as he swallowed, James said, "Peter's dead." "It should have been me," Marcus said. "We swapped. He said he couldn't sleep." And that's where I left them. By now the tide of war was turning, and I was busier than ever. I ended up spending a lot more time in Germany and Poland, but I was literally all over the place too. People think the tide of war turns and ebbs away to peace, but they forget or ignore the many recriminations. The bitterness bubbles for a long time. By the end of the war, up to 50 million people would be dead. That's 34,246 souls every single day, each one needing my helping hand and each one leaving behind their devastated friends, relatives, and broken-hearted lovers. Every now and then I have to hang on a few moments as the terrible news is enough to finish off a few of those grieving loved ones too. So it was hard keeping an eye on one person. Marcus was all over the place. But I'd see him in amongst the dead that was being swept away or tidied up into a necessary civility. Marcus had to deal with a lot of them too. Not their souls, just the decaying shells, the fleshy bits I can't physically take away and that I leave to return to the silence of the earth. I saw him when they went into that camp, one of the death camps that made me silent. It was exhausting, day after day. You may not know this, but at the point of passing, I can hear it, the sound of a soul moving from there to here. It's like a faint vibration, like the reverberation on a violin string, you might think. I don't hear the initial sound, just the fallout. And at this time, when Marcus was called in to clean up the corpses, it was a continuous thrumming note that had filled my head for days and weeks and months. I saw Marcus lowering the skeletal remnants of humanity into the great lime pits, their bodies locking together in a jumbled pile of sticks. He was wearing a scarf over his face, and his eyes had frozen to a dead stare of disbelief so that he could function, and pass each man, woman and child into the earth. The war was over, but the flood of souls continued. Disease, revenge killings, starvation, and the civil unrest of revolution erupted, sending more and more my way, and in the brutal rape of countless women by the marauding conquerors, there followed a flurry of unborns that had been ejected in a silent, unseen slaughter. Each unwanted life resonated with a piercing, brief cry in my head that seemed like a drip, drip, dripping tap that opened into a florid pouring. And in the noise and the torrent, I lost sight of Marcus, who had been sent to the Middle East to manage Britain's waning custody over Palestine. On July the 22nd, 1946, there is another bomb. The King David Hotel collapses, but he's not there, even if I am busy with 91 others. And then I spot him in the background as I slide from body to body, and he is lifting them, carrying them to a waiting place where they are covered. And then he starts to dig for more of those lost souls trapped in the hotel's rubble. A week later, he's caught up in the repercussions and violent street protests. I could see him there in the flurry of an angry mob, where Arab and Israeli adjutants were rounded on each other, and the British forces were caught in between and had become a human shield. Marcus was at the front, arms linked to his comrades, and they were pushing this way and that, and there were cries and shouts, and somewhere a bottle was thrown, and a cheer went up. Within minutes his face was blooded and streaming in red, so that he collapsed out of sight, and I had to weave between legs to find him, to see if I was needed. I assumed that the missile had been thrown by an Israeli protester, but I couldn't be sure. Sounds grand, saying a missile, don't you think? As if there is a petulant schoolmistress rebuking the riotous class for throwing paper pellets and saying, "You'll have someone's eye out with that." And it was only a potato after all, flying up in a steep trajectory to land on his face. But it is only as it hits that he discovers there are razor blades embedded in the flesh of that potato. And then when it slices into his upper cheek, very nearly does have his eye out. And then there is a gush of red that pours over him, and I was thinking, I'm not sure about this one. Maybe. But he lives, and he's pulled back to safety and whisked away to a medic. Superficial, the medic says, and a lot of gore, but it's not a deep cut, and though he stitches it. Afterwards, Marcus will carry the scar buried in the lines of his face, hiding it in a smile. But under the right conditions, under the grilling of the sun, it exposes the crooked star-shaped scar of his injury and reminds him bitterly of the Star of David. Not long after, Marcus and his mates dream of being on a ship home. There is some fuss about how they have had to stay overseas so long after the war has ended, and they've refused to move, refused to return to barracks until someone tells them precisely when they will be permitted to go home. The officer in charge had fired off orders telling them to stand down, to dismiss, but they stood their ground. He threatened them all with a charge for insubordination, but it had no effect. And then, feeling totally powerless, he'd become infuriated and turned a large gun on them to spray them all with bullets if they didn't immediately obey orders. It was at that point that I'd been pulled there. Some of you think I have the freedom that you enjoy to go where I like and act independently, but I have nothing to do with it, really. We all have a duty and a responsibility, it seems. Events conspire, shall we say. And I feel a strange feeling in my gut. A lot more than an instinct, I can assure you. It's as if something has taken a bite into the inside of me, And it can feel as brutal and painful as that, too. It's not a gentle tug. It feels as if I'm going to be turned inside out, and then I'm dragged from the centre. You know how water twists in on itself as it falls down a plug hole? Well, that's what it feels like. And in seconds, I'm there in a new place, faced with whatever situation is going to kill someone, or result in a death or 2, or 200, or 2,000. I can never be sure. I hear the gun being cocked, and I feel it move inside its oiled system. It clicks with a brutal emphatic mechanism, as if something terrible has already been decided. It is a fatal, dull sound. He moves the barrel back and forth over the men who stare at him anxiously. And the officer is shouting at them, his own men who stand frozen in their lines. And it's not clear who is most out of order, where the danger actually lies. The men wait, vulnerable and passive, but only as vulnerable and passive as trapped animals about to spring. Their eyes twitch with apprehension as they wonder if they will have to turn on this megalomaniac of an officer who might actually open fire on them for simply demanding they be allowed to go home. Or is it the officer? His eyes raging and white, his pulse pumping feverishly, and his hands shaking, as if he were a bomb, timed and fused now, that might just explode and wipe them all out, killing every last man that he has led for the last 4 years of war and 2 more years of overseas duty. I am silent. I move slowly down the line of men. I inhale the fragrance of their mortality. It's like the flavour and the bouquet of a good wine. But I can tell that some are closer to maturity than others. And then I catch the true scent, the pungent piquancy of imminent death. There it is, in the chaplain, the minister, for the men who has heard their confessions, spoken quietly into their fears, and heard their gentle tears in darkness with the passing of each comrade. The odour of death is heavy on him, as if he chooses to wear it. It is he who steps forward suddenly from behind the officer and moves to stand between the captain, MSD Morgan, and his men. He places himself directly in front of the barrel of the gun. "You will have to shoot me too, Michael," he says. "These men need to go home." No one dies. The moment eases and is diffused in this unexpected grace. An old ballad is sung about how old soldiers never die. They simply fade away. And these old soldiers who have survived so much now fade away back to their homes in the streets and towns or the distant houses of rural England. They will be in their homes within a month. But I will remember the taste of death upon Father Critchley. And so it is. I meet him a year later in a hospital ward where half of a foul growth has been cut from his lung, and he fails to recover. Marcus does not fade away. He builds his life in Chelsfield, makes his gardens, plants a family and grows his seed that will in time drift to other fields. And not long after the episode with the peanut, I meet him. One day, when he's 54, I see him unloading turf, emptying his lorry load of new lawn to finish a smart redesigned garden up in one of the grand houses of Chislehurst. And Mrs. Clark has been quite persistent in getting things done precisely, insistent at times, because she is paying after all, as she reminds them at regular intervals. And she's paying a lot of money, and she wants the lawn down before Easter. So they press on, but Marcus's mate George is off sick. Yet Marcus can still work, and he does, all morning, then collecting and unloading the turf, until he has a break, a cup of tea from his flask and a quick cheese sandwich, and it's then that he feels the first twinge flutter in his chest, and I feel it too, reverberating, like that string, resonant. I catch the scent of a heartbeat. But Marcus does not heed the warning in his chest, which he dismisses as indigestion. Even when he is done for the day and the turf has been stacked ready to lay on the next day, it's only then that he feels the pain bite deep into him and bring him down. Mrs. Clark might get her lawn laid ready for Easter, but it is not the next day. And it is not Marcus who will lay the turves, as much as he wishes he could. George leaves his sick bed to complete that for him. Marcus lies in his own unfamiliar bed, on a hospital ward, and he will lie there for some time as his heart eases and rests, and he is told it will never fully recover, and he must just rest and change and begin a gentler life. And I realise I am too early, whatever the scent of his heartbeat tells me. Well, it's all new for Marcus after that. He stays at home, and with Deborah they cut and sew, churning out oven gloves, plastic baby bibs, stitching mile upon mile of biased binding to edge their designs, or they make fiddly teddy bears that they abandon as too complex and unprofitable, and then they buy a knitting machine and slide it back and forth, making anything from bobble hats and scarves to jumpers. And they get some part-time work cleaning the local village hall where the younger generation come to party every Saturday night, and they have to clean up their messes, expunging the vomit of youth that is spewed out after one too many. But Marcus does not complain. He presses on, getting on with the work. And they raise money, lots of money, with a monthly sales of second-hand clothes, books, pots, pans, puppets and train sets, and everything and anything that the locals pass on as unwanted. And they set up a short map bowls group and collect trophies so that their sideboard becomes a forest of celebration to competition after competition, a herd of shiny figures frozen in the delivery of their bowl. After a few years, they collect jokey certificates from the Grand Order of the Bias and have fun at bowls, spinning, turning, wavering, and falling like the inevitability of fate towards the jack. It is the summer of 1994. It's D-Day, June the 6th. He is dressed for bowls, but every year he remembers buttoning his uniform that morning and his silent prayer to see the day through. He recalls the moment he climbed into the truck on that landing craft, and he caught a glimpse of Peter and James in the back, and wondered if that would be the last glimpse. He climbs into the car and glances across to Deborah and smiles as the clutch bites and the car moves slowly forwards. She knows. She hears him in his sleep calling out, struggling to breathe as if underwater. She understands the quiet memories that he has carried all these years. "Come on, let's go," she sings. "We're going to show 'em what for and win." It is a sunny day for bowling, outside in this weather on the green, and it's trimmed and neat and orderly like a perfect lawn. Marcus remembers the turves he was unloading to make a lawn once long ago, the day he left a job incomplete, This lawn is finished beautifully, he thinks. And then Marcus looks beyond the collection of grey-legged bowlers, each in their regulation flat shoes, and he studies the edge of the trimmed green carpet they move upon. He feels a twinge. Is it regret? He had missed the hard labouring of his early life at first, but he does not regret the happiness and the joys of the last few decades. He looks at Deborah and smiles. She is on the green, bowling her last bowl. She claps her hands joyfully as she cries out, watching her bowl ease up and settle next to the jack with the softest kiss. She walks towards him, slowed as if in a dream, and he recalls her younger beauty when they had walked across a garden and he proposed on their wedding day, on Boxing Day, when despite the chill they'd gone outside for the light to get a better photo, and there he was in his new uniform, and she in a delicate veil that draped from her head and covered her shoulders in lace. He looks at her now, at how her feet press into the lawn. She steps towards him. She sits down, turns, and kisses his cheek. "We might beat them at this rate," she says. The sky is clear except for this huge Boeing taking people off to their holidays. The vast blue is empty of clouds, so unlike that day half a century ago, which was full of the darkest clouds and danger. Then he hears a roaring in his head, like the sea, the waves churning in a surging rising of painful memory, and for a second he is sitting in that truck, revving the engine and waiting for the flash of light as the ramp goes down to head off up the beach again. Only he's 22 now, but he can feel the awful thudding of the engine in his chest. It builds powerfully, throbbing and convulsive until it rises to an intense, explosive burst. When I look back, I see him as if he is asleep, his head gently dropping to rest on Deborah's shoulder. And for a second she thinks that too, until it stays, heavy and final. "Well, there you are at last," I say, and he looks up at me. But he turns to see the crowd of people in white gathering around himself, and hear the concerned murmuring of sadness in their voices. And then as they step back, he sees Deborah in the middle, clasping his face as her tears fall. "Don't worry now," I say. "She will be following soon." And he steps from himself, leaving the pain and the anguish that had flooded him in that final, brief moment.